Welcome back to this Gambling Harm Forum, which is a co-production presented by RMIT and the Ethnic Communities Council of Victoria. Just before the break, we were talking about what is gambling and what sort of gambling is happening, and we had some interesting information come through about that gambling is actually falling where we are at the moment, but people who do gamble are doing it more and more. So it is a real problem. But let's now look at who is gambling. And there are quite a lot of groups. And one group that interested me, because I work as a lecturer, is international students, people who come to Australia to study. Quite often they will pay, or their parents, a lot of money to come here to study. And there is a problem because some of them lose a lot of that money through gambling. Now, Bayu Pratama had a problem with gambling. And Bayu, do you want to tell us your story?
Yeah, I think I would like to tell my story. Start off from the high school. When I did high school locally in here, there are a lot of young kids or young people who are talking about gambling, and obviously some of their parents had previous involvement in gambling as well. And when I was at school, it's being really normalized talking about the odds, and particularly about sports as well as horse racing. But when I finished off my high school and I delved into university environment, it becomes clearer, and for me, according to my experience, I encounter a lot of students that are spending their free time in gambling. And that including myself, obviously. I started off gambling from $5 in the pub with my friends, and then it becomes socializing gambling on my own and with my friends. And then all of a sudden, when my friends doesn't want to go anymore, I started to go by myself. It becomes more kind of like recreational gambling, and it kind of let me think that like I do gambling just for the sake of spending my own time, and led me to believe that I can make money out of it. And obviously, and from that point onwards, I started to working in the racing industry as well.
Did you?
I did, yes.
So there was an upside to doing the gambling.
Yes,
yeah,
so
yeah.
it's for me. I'm trying to find out more about racing and how does the horses works, and a little bit little bit of inside information, obviously. But again, when I delve into that industry, I witnessed a lot of abuse, obviously drugs abuse. And
how bad did it get for you?
It was quite bad. It come to the point of social isolation is one particular key issues. I find it myself that I couldn't hang out with my friend because I started to work at 4 a.m. in the morning, finish up at 10 a.m. and then I have to come back to racing at 1 p.m., finish up at 4 p.m. So that doesn't really allow me to have a social interaction, and all I think about was just either gambling or just working. So it becomes clearer as well, and as international student, a lot of them really stressing out about their studies, about the pressure from the families as well. They have a certain expectation that you finish off the study, you come back to my country, you're gonna do the best possible. And obviously, with the pressure mounted and with not a lot of people to talk to, they're starting to lose their platform to study, and also utilizing gambling as part of their getaway.
And I imagine mum and dad will get very annoyed about this too. They've gone there to study and they've spent the money.
Absolutely. And obviously, coming from culturally and linguistically diverse background, we tend to have a huge stigma that if you do things wrong, if you, let's say, take a recreational drug or do gambling, it's a shame for your family. And myself as a young people, and a lot of international students who are young as well, they don't have the platform to think about that, to even talk about that, because it's such a shaming, and it's a shame culture essentially. And when you talk to your mates or to your friends, they will using a specific explicit language, and tells you that you're not worthy, or it's a lot of culture, shame culture is still delved in the cult community.
And you must have heard stories, as I have as a lecturer, from about people who are international students who have to go home. They've done the gambling, they spend more time gambling than studying, so they don't do well, and they go home not only with a fail, but they go home with none of the family money left that they had too. That must be terribly, terribly hard on them.
Absolutely, and it also left you, coming back to a country, you coming back to your origin, obviously, and you think that you might be able to get away with it because there is no gambling environment, but actually, when you already delve in gambling industry or gambling or playing gambling, you always thought about something to do, and obviously in each country have their own way of gambling, and that is really crucial as well. And obviously, as you mentioned, coming home with no money left from the family, it is absolutely excruciating, and even from young people perspective, spending their time years and years.
So I don't know how many of you here in the audience, we've got quite a lot of people here, would have known that international students, that there was that real problem with gambling. Put your hands up if you knew about it. Well, remarkably, a lot, which is great, because working in the industry, working in university, not knowing about that, I probably represent a different part of the community to you, but that was a big revelation for me. That's university students and international students, and a little later we'll talk about what can be done to perhaps stop this kind of horrible dilemma that people get themselves into. But I was I was going to an awards night at Crown Casino not long ago, and I went to have a look at the baccarat table, imagining I was James Bond, and I was just watching people play, and an older couple came to the table and started playing the baccarat table. They put in $100 and then another $100 and then another 100, and these were an older Greek couple that they certainly didn't look wealthy, they certainly didn't look happy, and they didn't look healthy. And they just put money after money after money down that hole in that table. Dimitri Bouras has worked with older people who has got this sort of issue. What's your experience? Do you see that sort of thing quite a lot?
Thank you for the introduction. Your example was a prime example. Elderly Greek people tend to not use electronic gambling methods. The first generation of Greek migrants to Australia happened to retire from work around about the same time when Joan Kirner introduced the pokies, Tabaret, to Victoria, I believe, in 1993. So the first generation of Greek Australian migrants actually retired that year. So boredom, emptiness, association with a 40-year job suddenly were factors that impacted these retirees. And of course, the legalisation of gambling gave them an outlet. And it was, I remember back in 1993, it was a huge thing. The advertising with Tabaret and the new Tats Pokies that were introduced was quite horrendous. Greek welfare has, throughout the years, developed several community education activities regarding harm minimisation. But through my experience, I believe keeping the elderly called communities active and engaged in community activities, such as a cardiac rehabilitation program, a Heart Moves program, a community health centre, a walking group, can do a lot to keep these people not only occupied but stimulated and included. Social isolation is a massive factor which impacts gambling within the Greek community, unfortunately.
And that goes back to this couple that I saw who certainly looked very unhealthy and very unhappy. Yes. Well, Dr. Mark Halloran, who's worked with older women in prison, nanas in prison, I think is the term that's being used. The ones that you worked in, was there a correlation between their gambling and the fact that these older women were in prison in some cases?
Well, I suppose gambling is now considered a criminogenic factor by the Productivity Commission, and we tend to think of gambling, particularly within prisons. It affects about 30%, according to the little amount of research we've got of the prison population. But actually, we only see about 1% of that prison population. We tend to think of it as affecting lower socioeconomic people because gambling venues occur at a higher rate within lower socioeconomic postcodes. But what I've seen is that gambling is indiscriminate and it can strike like the hand of God. And so I saw a lot of older women who were middle-aged, had come to prison for fraud. It was the first time that they had ever committed a crime. So they'd stolen from their workplace, sometimes hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars to fund their gambling addiction. And this had come from, I know the last speaker mentioned the introduction of poker machines through the Kerner government, and I think the story of the first female government whip, Carolyn Hirsch, who come to speak at one of the correctional facilities that I work at, really exemplifies the story of older women. What you see with gambling is it either ranges between excitement and escape, and a lot of these women, particularly with poker machines, it's about escape from distress, breakdown of a marriage, postnatal depression. In Carolyn Hirsch's case, she was part of the team that introduced poker machines to Victoria. She was a psychologist before she was an MP, but after the suicide death of her daughter, she became addicted to poker machines because poker machines offer you the zone, which is escape from distress. She compared it to what she would think of as being in an opium den.
Wow.
And so she lost everything, and that's devastating. And then people go to prison as well.
Yeah. Look, thank you very much for that, Dr. Mark Haller. And Dr. Mark Zernzak is the director of the Justice Uniting Church and has looked at poorer communities and an analysis of poorer communities. So you would agree with that the one comment that Mark made was that poorer communities are the ones that are more affected?
Certainly when it comes to pokies, that is the case. We've seen a concentration of pokies in areas that have lower income, and that's largely based on the pokies businesses figure out where they can make the most money, so they situate the pokies in the places they will make the most money for themselves without necessarily much concern for what the impact on the broader community is. When it comes to other forms of gambling, though, it actually does vary quite a bit. So, for example, if we look at sports betting or we look at race betting, then it's actually people on higher incomes who tend to bet on those forms of gambling.
Okay. Well, look, we'll have to leave it there for the moment. We'll probably come back to you a little bit later on. This is the Gambling Harm Forum, and it's coming to you from the Capitol Theatre in Swanston Street in Melbourne. We will be back after this short break, and when we do come back, we're going to look at, we've already heard some of the effects of gambling, but the effects go more than just a person who is ending up in jail for their own effects, but also what happens to the rest of the community, their friends, their family. We'll look at that coming up in a minute.